Good day. Today is Friday, 25th July 2025, and I am going to return in this program to a discussion of the military situation in Ukraine because developments are now becoming very dramatic and things are starting to move extremely fast, much faster than they have done since the Russian offensive began in April. Anyway, briefly, late last night we had this report from the Russian Defense Ministry. In Krasnoarmeysk direction, as a result of offensive actions, the center group of forces liberated Novo Economi, Cherskoye and Zverevo. Now, Krasnoarmeysk is the Soviet name for Pokrovsk. It's the name that the Russians continue to use when they refer to Pokrovsk. They've never recognized the legitimacy of the various name change laws that Ukraine has passed. And so when they talk about Krasnoarmeysk, they're referring to Pokrovsk. And both of the two places that have now been captured, Novo Economi and Zverevo, are in fact located in the Pokrovsk area. Now, Novo Economi Cherskoye is, of course, the large village immediately to the east of Mirnograd. It's disconnected from Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, but it's part of essentially the same conurbation. It looks rather like a kind of satellite village of the towns. It's probably a place where people who live in the town have cottages, as is very standard in the former Soviet Union. And of course, there is a coal mine between Novo Economichskoye and Mirnograd, and there's no word yet that the Russians are in control of this coal mine. So it would be an error to say that the fall of this village of Novo Economichskoye means that the Russians are literally at the gates of Mirnograd, or that they are yet to enter Mirnograd, at least from the east. We'll see that there's more reports that suggest they might have entered Mirnograd from a different direction. But anyway, there's no reports that the coal mine has fallen, not so far. And important as the fall of this village is, perhaps it does not signal immediately the fall of Pokrovsk. I remember hearing a report about a week ago that this village was as important for Pokrovsk as Solidar was for Bakhmut. I don't actually accept that view. There are other places. I think Mirnograd is altogether much more important to Pokrovsk than Novo Economichskoye is. But anyway, it is an important place. It has been much talked about. There's been much commentary in the media, in the Telegram channels and the blogs and the YouTube channels that cover the war, and amongst the various mapping projects. The loss of this village would indeed signal the beginning of the end of Ukrainian defense of Pokrovsk. Well, that, however, is not the only news coming from the situation in and around Pokrovsk over the last 24 hours. Now, yesterday, the Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, said that the Russian army has now begun an operation to encircle the other village, the village of Rodinskaya, which is located to the north of Pokrovsk. And they provided a great deal of information as to how that was being carried out. And anyway, it looks as if a Russian operation to capture Rodinskaya, north of Pokrovsk, the village that lies on the main road leading into Pokrovsk from the north. It looks as if this operation is now underway. I spoke about Mirnograd. I said that there's no information yet that the Russians have captured the coal mine between Mirnograd and Novo Economi, but they have apparently entered, the reports are saying that they have broken into Mirnograd, an actual industrial suburb of Pokrovsk, a much bigger place than Novo Economi, that they've actually entered Mirnograd from the south and that fighting is already taking place there. And going back to that report of the Russian Defense Ministry, it refers to a village called Zverevo, which has also been captured. This is in the area of southwest Pokrovsk, where the Russians are also known to be attacking. It's the area from which the various reconnaissance groups, Russian reconnaissance and special forces groups, have penetrated deep inside of Pokrovsk. It looks as if the Russians are now consolidating their control of some of this territory in the southwestern areas of Pokrovsk. And in fact, there have been more reports from the Pokrovsk area, which are more detailed than this, much more detailed than this report from the Russian Defense Ministry. And they claim that as well as this village, Zverova, the Russians have also captured other villages in this area, maybe Shakhtarsky, maybe Leontovichi, which is also located in this area, that they are indeed deep inside Pokrovsk. And there are reports that the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk itself are now becoming increasingly nervous and alarmed. They are no longer sure where exactly the Russians are inside Pokrovsk. The result has been apparently an upward spike of friendly fire incidents as Ukrainian units fire at each other, unsure whether they are perhaps Ukrainian or Russian. And apparently this has been going on, suggesting increasing disorganization within Pokrovsk. Now, interestingly, and possibly coincidentally, presumably coincidentally, last night there was a major breakdown in the Starlink system. Starlink themselves are saying that this was the result of a software fault. But in many places around the world, Starlink wasn't working. And it turns out that it wasn't working for a time in the Ukrainian front lines. Now, I am not an expert on technology. Starlink insists that it was a software fault. I wonder whether some people in the Ukrainian army, some of the soldiers in Pokrovsk, might be wondering whether it wasn't somehow Russian interference or jamming with Starlink. Maybe not. Maybe that is indeed impossible, as many claim. But maybe that was what happened in order to increase the sense of confusion and chaos amongst the Ukrainian forces defending Pokrovsk. Let me stress, I have no information at all to support that claim. And of course, the Starlink themselves are insisting that it was entirely a software fault. Perhaps it was. But you can imagine the effect on the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers in Pokrovsk, already unsure where the Russians are inside the town, involved in friendly fire incidents with other Ukrainian units, uncertain who is who, unable apparently to communicate. It must have added to the sense of chaos and confusion that clearly existed yesterday. Now, the overall sense that I'm getting is of an escalating crisis in Pokrovsk, of an increasingly chaotic and disorganized Ukrainian defense. There's been no further word today about the Russians cutting the E50 road junctions inside Pokrovsk itself, something that I discussed at length in my program yesterday. Maybe that has happened, maybe it hasn't, I don't know. But anyway, the Russians, according to their own accounts, have now captured Novo Economi. They're encircling Rodinskaya. They have captured Zverova. The Ukrainians admit that their forces in Pokrovsk are in effect confused and disorganized. I can't help but feel that the Battle of Pokrovsk is coming to a much more rapid end than anybody, including myself, expected. Now, there are reports that the Ukrainians are trying to bring troops to this area to try to stabilize the situation. I remember that they did, or said that they were doing this very same thing at the time of the collapse in Avdiivka in February of last year. I wonder whether the situation now has become so bad that it is irretrievable. If the Russians do capture Rodinska and they do capture other places in southwest Pokrovsk, and some reports say that they are in the center of the town, then my guess is that Pokrovsk probably has only days left before it falls entirely under Russian control. Anyway, we shall see. But these are dramatic developments, and they must be intensifying the sense of crisis that already exists on the Ukrainian battle lines. Now, there has also been further news from Kupiansk, which is, of course, at the other end of the front line. There are reports there that street fighting is indeed taking place in Kupiansk. I remember reading on TASS that this was the case some days ago, maybe about a week ago, that the Russians have broken into Kupiansk itself and that street fighting is taking place in the town and that the Russians have mostly encircled Kupiansk. There was no confirmation of this, but yesterday apparently a video appeared which clearly showed that Russian troops inside Kupiansk fighting the Ukrainians there. It looks as if an encounter battle is underway, or perhaps more accurately a storming operation, and that the Russians are indeed fighting inside Kupiansk. By the way, I should say that there is apparently video film which confirms the presence of Russian troops in Novo Economi and shows Russian troops raising their flags in various parts of Novo Economi, confirming the Ministry of Defense report that the village has fallen. So anyway, there it is. Very, very rapid deterioration of the situation for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk. Information that Kupiansk, confirmation that Kupiansk is indeed in the process of being stormed. Now, it looks as if similarly dramatic events are playing out in the area of Konstantinovka. There is apparently now film confirmation that the village of Yablonovka, which is located south of Konstantinovka, is indeed now entirely under Russian control. And there are also further reports that the Russians are in complete control of the village of Sherbinka, which is located immediately to the west of Toretsk. And there are reports that the Russians are now pushing towards the two remaining villages south of the Klebanbek reservoir, which continue to be under Ukrainian control. These are Klebanbek itself and Katerinovka. The Ukrainian troops in these places, in these villages, seem to be mostly surrounded. The village of Plesheyevka to the north is under Russian control, but it looks as if these two villages are also likely to fall fairly soon. The Russians apparently have pushed further from Belagora that they captured a few days ago, a little further to the north still, and are in the process of capturing another village called Alexandro Shultine. It looks as if Ukrainian defenses south of Konstantinovka are now also in the process of collapse. We're seeing what several months of attrition since April has done. The Ukrainian forces are buckling right across the battlefronts, and it does seem as if Pokrovsk itself, the situation there, is now in deep crisis. And, well, based on everything that I have heard, it does look as if this town is indeed about to fall. Well, that's the situation on the battlefronts. There's lots of things going on in other places too, no doubt, but those seem to be the most important pieces of news over the last 24 hours, and I would say that they are dramatic ones. Now, that is not what you would get the impression of from reading the Western media. They continue to focus on the protests in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities against Zelensky's decision to bring NABU and SAPO, the two anti-corruption agencies, under the direct control of Ukraine's prosecutor general. Now, there is a lot of coverage over the last couple of hours in the Western media and on parts of the internet concerning a statement that Zelensky has made that he's prepared to propose to the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, which, by the way, has is no longer in session. It's broken up for the summer holiday. Anyway, he's prepared to propose to the Rada, to the Ukrainian parliament, a new law which will be enacted supposedly in 2 weeks' time, reorganizing NABU and SOPA, restoring their independence of the prosecutor general, and supposedly reversing many of the changes in the law that Zelensky himself and the Rada have just passed, basically ending the independence of these two agencies and bringing them under the control of the prosecutor general. Now, there are lots of reports that this is a major concession by Zelensky, that he has essentially backed down or reversed course. I would say that as of this time, I've not seen the text of this new proposed law. I'm not sure that anybody has. And the public statements that I am familiar with that Zelensky is making is that, yes, the two agencies will no longer be under the direct control of Ukraine's prosecutor general, but they will continue to be under Zelensky's personal control. So, effectively, if this is correct, it seems to me that far from being a reversal, it means that he is centralizing control of these two agencies even further, bringing them under his own personal control rather than leaving their control in the hands of an official, the prosecutor general, who is, of course, accountable to him. It may be that this new law, in practice, doesn't mean very much and isn't the back down that many people appear to believe that it is. If that is not the case, if it is indeed the case that Zelensky has reversed himself, then the reason for that is not the protests that have taken place in Kiev or the other Ukrainian cities. I've been continuing to monitor these protests. The protests continue to be, as far as I can see, relatively small. They continue to be made up of much the same people. in fact, my impression is that it's the same people, in fact, exactly, who have been turning up night after night to protest. They continue to be the same middle class and youngish people as before. There's no sign that the protests are spreading to other sections of Ukrainian society. The protest movement has apparently tried to persuade sections of the military to join the protests, but so far there is no sign that this is happening to any degree. The High Command, Syrskyi, and the General Staff, they continue to remain loyal to Zelensky and to carry out his orders. And of course, there's no sign that the security services, GUR, the service headed by Budanov, or the SBU, the service headed by Malyuk, it doesn't seem that these are peeling away or are disobeying Zelensky at all. Nor is there any sign that the nationalist brigades, or indeed any part of the nationalist movement, are attaching themselves to these protests either. And as for the big oligarchs, Rinat Akhmetov and all of these, they're basically silent about these protests. So if it is indeed the case that Zelensky is backing down, then it is not because of the protests or because he's facing any significant internal challenge within Ukraine. It is because he is coming under intense pressure from the European Union and above all Germany to reverse the decision that he has just made. Now, it is very difficult for me to get exact information about this, but I've heard reports that the German Foreign Minister, Mr. Westphal, has rushed to Kiev to try to talk Zelensky out of this move. There is no doubt at all that Zelensky has had conversations with his dear and devoted friend, Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, and apparently Zelensky has assured Starmer that this new law that he's now proposing will take the sting out of the decision to bring the two agencies under the control of the Prosecutor General. There are other reports that EU ambassadors tried to contact senior Ukrainian officials to bring up the subject of this law, of the centralization of control under the Prosecutor General and Zelensky of these two organizations, that the EU ambassadors have been trying to remonstrate with Ukrainian officials and indeed Zelensky himself about this law. There are reports that they were not able to get through, that their telephone calls were going unanswered. There's even a report I saw somewhere which I found astonishing and difficult to believe, but then in today's Kiev anything I suppose is possible, that some of the ambassadors, or maybe all of the ambassadors, were kept waiting in a room, but that nobody in the end from the Ukrainian government would come to see them. Anyway, it does seem as if there's been a frantic scramble by the Europeans, by the Germans most of all, trying to get this decision reversed. And there's also been threats that if this law is implemented, that this could derail Ukraine's application for EU membership. Now, the exact realities of all of this EU pressure are difficult for me to say. Whether it really is true, the telephone calls are not being accepted, that Ukrainian officials are not meeting with EU ambassadors. Well, I don't know about these things. As I said, I've seen the reports, but always there is rumour in these situations, and rumour is not the same as fact. What I would say is that there is clearly a lot of pressure from the EU. The EU has been seriously embarrassed by what has happened. And besides, as a number of people have pointed out, Nabu and Sapor, as well as being American operations, are also European operations. I understand that most of the people who sit on the board of Nabu, for example, are actually Europeans rather than Americans. And Nabu and Sapor have been used as much by the Europeans as the Americans to basically maintain control of policy and politics in Kiev. And the EU, as an organization, always wants to retain control and always seeks to expand its control whenever it can, and probably won't be happy if that control is in some way being reduced. But there is, of course, another, probably even more compelling factor, which is that, as I've discussed in recent programs, Zelensky, Shmyhal, his new defense minister and former prime minister, other Ukrainian officials are busy demanding still more money from the Europeans. Shmyhal says that in order to keep the Ukrainian military operating next year in 2026, Ukraine needs $60 billion on the table. The totality of what it needs is said to be $120 billion. That's from Reuters. And of course, that's the demands for the military. There are also other demands. There are demands for maintaining the government. The United States used to pay the salaries of many of the officials. It's unlikely that it will continue to do so. The Europeans are going to have to pick up the slack on that if they want to keep Project Ukraine going. There's all sorts of other operations going on in Ukraine. We are talking about an enterprise, a project that is costing the Europeans tens upon tens of billions of euros every year. And all of this at a time when there is a budgetary crisis in Europe, at a time when the pressure is to cut down on costs, where at a time when political parties are starting to emerge and gain traction with the European electorate, expressing skepticism about this endless shoveling of money and resources at Kiev and Zelensky and Ukraine. It's at a time when the political situation in Germany itself is on a knife edge. Merz's coalition is looking unstable. There are disagreements between the CDU and the SPD. There's unhappiness within the CDU at Merz's leadership. There is an increasingly strong challenge from the AfD and other parties like Die Linke and the BSW, Sarah Wagenknecht's party, which is still growing, even if it didn't manage to break into the Bundestag in the recent election. So a lot of that is happening. And of course, there's also the perennial problem of Ukraine's endless resort to the two international organizations, the IMF and the World Bank, for funding. And in fact, Ukraine has just received another loan, I believe, from the World Bank, from the International Monetary Fund, something which seems to me completely irrational and entirely contrary to the IMF's former rules. Lending to a bankrupt has never made any kind of sense. The Western powers, the IMF, the World Bank, have in effect been doing that ever since the Maidan crisis of 2014. Just to say, I've written extensively about this. They continue to do it, but of course they've always linked their various loans and fund dispersals, as the Europeans have done, to progress in addressing the issue of corruption in Ukraine. Now, my own personal view is that Nabu and Sapor have not actually been successful in addressing the problem of corruption in Ukraine. My own view is that since the 2014 Maidan crisis, the change of government there, the revolution of dignity, as some call it, the coup as others do, since then corruption in Ukraine has actually got worse. But anyway, the existence of these two agencies, the fact that they do bring prosecutions and institute court cases, including against senior officials, not that these seem to me ever to lead very far. But anyway, the existence of these organizations has up to now provided the fig leaf, enabling the money to continue to flow to Ukraine. And, well, if these two organizations are gone, or if they are directly under Zelensky's control, then, of course, doing all of this is going to be much, much more difficult to justify in the terms of the IMF and the World Bank. It is legally impossible, but then I would say that it is already legally impossible and has been legally impossible since 2014, but that hasn't prevented happening. But anyway, it would probably become so impossible, so grotesque, that it might be still more difficult to justify to an IMF and World Bank board in which independent directors nominated, for example, by the Global South, have for some time now been asking awkward questions. And of course, within Europe, trying to justify and explain this to Western electorates might be a challenge, and I'm guessing to the German electorate most of all. So for all of these reasons, the Europeans are now scrambling to try to get Zelensky to reverse what he has done. And of course, the one thing that Zelensky cannot risk is a cut-off of funds from the West. That is, for him, the overriding, the single most important priority. Even more important than the supply of weapons is the supply of money. Without the money, his regime might indeed disintegrate, because it is the flow of money from the West that glues it all together. So, if Zelensky does genuinely fear that the money flows from the West are going to stop, if he doesn't reverse what he has done, then that might cause him to reverse what he has done. Notice, however, that all of the pressure has been coming from the Europeans. It doesn't seem to be coming to any degree from the United States. I'm not aware that Donald Trump has said anything about it, or the Vice President, J.D. Vance, or Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. There have been expressions of concern from Lindsey Graham and people like him, but I don't get the sense that the administration itself is too bothered. And the reason is, of course, that they have already stopped providing, or they say they have already stopped providing, direct funding to Ukraine. They're no longer supplying weapons directly to Ukraine. They're expecting the Europeans to pay for them. And Trump himself, for the reasons I've discussed in previous programs, does not like Nabu or Sapor very much and has no reason to do so. So anyway, there we are. We will just have to wait and see whether or not there is a genuine reversal by Zelensky in this new law that he is said to be proposing. I'm going to express my own guess that there is going to be no fundamental proposal at all. There's going to be a rearrangement of the structures, but Nabu and Sapor will continue to be ultimately under his own direct control from this time. I don't think he has any intention of letting them become independent once more. And I suspect that the new law that he's now proposing is basically a way to an off-ramp, if you like, for the Europeans and for the international organizations, the IMF and the World Bank, giving them an opportunity, an excuse to keep the money still flowing to Ukraine on the grounds that, in fact, Ukrainian civil society protested the subordination of Nabu and Sapor to the Prosecutor General's office, and Zelensky complied, and for that reason there is no reason to stop the funding, because the anti-corruption drive in Ukraine continues as before. Now, one thing that has come out from the protests is clear statements from people who are protesting about their own belief in the fact of Zelensky's own corruption. I've even seen one report that says that Zelensky and presumably his team have been skimming up to $10 billion a year. Of course, I have no way of verifying these numbers, and that does seem to me extreme, even by Ukrainian standards. There's also apparently open demands that Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, resign. I haven't yet seen demands that Zelensky himself resign. But of course, if Yermak were to resign, if other senior officials were to resign, it would certainly give the appearance that the regime was disintegrating, and it might indeed implode. I still don't believe, to be frank, that this is going to happen. In fact, I see no sign of it. But I would repeat again what I said before. If Zelensky is forced to step down, if his government does indeed collapse in the way that some people like Owen Matthews, writing in the Daily Telegraph, want, then contrary to their expectations, it will not stabilize the situation in Ukraine. On the contrary, it will further destabilize it, and we will see a return to political chaos, and the processes of disintegration and collapse will accelerate and gain momentum. It is very, very difficult to pull off a change of government in the middle of a war and in a society as fragmented and as dysfunctional as Ukraine. I would say it was impossible. Anyway, there it is. We shall see what happens. I myself think that Zelensky is still secure. As I said at the start of the program, I believe that he's still got all of the major forces in Ukraine continue to support him. It seems to me that he still has his hands firmly on the levers of power. I expect the protests eventually to abate. I personally expect that Nabu and Sapor will indeed, in some form, continue to be under his overall control from now on. But there's no doubt that he does have to do something to address the concerns of the Europeans, and that, it seems to me, is what he's doing. I think that far too much time and energy is being spent discussing Nabu, Sapor, this particular crisis, the intrigues within the Zelensky government, and the protests that have been taking place in Kiev and other places. The real crisis of Ukraine, or to be more precise, of the regime, is not on the streets of Kiev. It is on the battlefronts. It is in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, and in the areas south of Konstantinovka, and perhaps ultimately most important of all, in the area in the area east of the Dnieper River, where the Russians are steadily advancing further and further westwards towards the Dnieper River. It's not, as I said, in Kiev. That's not to say that what is going on in Kiev is not interesting. To me, it is a symptom of the crisis, however, not the crisis itself. It's a sign that there is deterioration on the battle lines, critical deterioration on the battle lines, and that Zelensky and his officials, as I've discussed in previous programs, and as we've recently discussed on the Duran, are now urgently taking steps to try to shore up their position in Kiev and over the long term, even as the situation around them starts to crumble and potentially fall apart. That is my view. Now, I've had a very interesting series of emails from a source discussing the overall state of the two armies, providing me with detailed information, or at least detailed analysis of the likely casualties that each of the two armies have suffered. Now, I should say that the analysis on the casualties is based on AI, heavily uses AI technology, which, for the record, I think is reliable, very reliable, if used properly, and I'm confident that this source is using that information properly. It is complex and very extensive, and I've not had enough time to digest it properly, so I will probably discuss it more fully in my next program. But the same source has also provided me with information about the evolution of the two armies, the Russian and Ukrainian army, that are battling it out at the moment in this area of Ukraine. And this is actually quite interesting. The point this person is making, this source is making, and by the way, I should make it clear that this source is a very well-informed person. I have corresponded with him on many occasions. Anyway, the point this person is making is that at the very start of the war, in the spring and summer of 2022, the Ukrainians were able to field an army whose soldiers had received extensive training from the West, and many of whom had previously seen combat in Donbass. They'd already been involved in fighting in 2014 and thereafter. The view of this source is that in 2022, in early 2022, the Ukrainians were better trained than the Russians, significantly better trained than the Russians. He also says that in early 2022, the Russians had serious problems in coordinating big formations that work on doing something that historically the Russians had excelled at doing, which is that moving large units across the battlefronts and coordinating those units so that they operated together seamlessly as a team, that all of those skills had basically been lost, and that the Russians had major problems sorting that out, and that their coordination at that time was extremely poor. It is also the case, and this I remember myself, that in the spring and summer of 2022, indeed right up until the autumn of 2022, the Russian forces which were conducting the special military operation were without a unified command. I found that remarkable at the time. I didn't believe that it could be the case, but it turned out that it was. That, in fact, the various groups of forces were all operating independently of each other. They were all, of course, responding to the General Staff in Moscow, but there was no actual commander tasked with coordinating those forces on the battlefronts, and there was no forward battlefield headquarters to coordinate those forces. As I said, that seemed to me extraordinary, but it turned out that it was true. By late 2022, after the fighting in Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, the Kharkiv offensive, and the Kherson offensive, the Ukrainian military had suffered very extensive losses, and many of the best people, many of the best trained soldiers had been killed or critically injured. And already by that time, there was an overall weakening in the quality of Ukrainian forces. Thereafter, the situation deteriorated still further. By the end of August 2023, 78% of the men who had been called up to the Ukrainian army in 2022, the well-trained, highly motivated men, were either dead or severely injured. And the result was that the quality of training had become very degraded, and that the situation within the Ukrainian army was no longer remotely what it was. And the situation then continued to deteriorate. By mid-2024, out of the remaining 22% of the original contingent that had existed that had been called up in 2022, out of that, only 83% had most likely been either killed or critically injured. Now, I have to say that these are astonishing figures, and I have read other ones, different ones. I seem to remember, for example, that in 2023, I read a report somewhere that by the end of 2023, despite extensive recruitment, the bulk of the men in the Ukrainian army were still people who had enlisted in the spring and summer of 2022. But overall, I think that these figures are consistent, certainly, with the trend. The Ukrainian army has been getting not only smaller and smaller, but less and less good. And the Russian army, by contrast, has been improving. And again, this source says that whereas the Russians had all of those very clear and obvious problems in early 2022, the Russian High Command realized that these problems existed. The commanders, the generals who had been responsible for training and working out how to coordinate units were sacked and were replaced with better and more experienced generals. The army was built up from the ground up, and gradually, steadily, the quality has improved so that training has become more extended, time periods of training have lengthened, and slowly, gradually, we've now reached a level of proficiency much higher than that of the Ukrainians, but also probably at least equal to, and probably significantly better, in fact, than what you would find in the West. And apparently coordination of pilots, drones, artillery, targeting of Ukrainian positions, all of that has improved significantly. And this analysis also says that the turning point was the Battle of Bakhmut in the spring of 2023. The Russians suffered significantly fewer losses than the Ukrainians. The losses that this analysis gives for the Ukrainians in the Battle of Bakhmut are off the scale. I mean, they're horrifying. But as I said, I need to unpack these figures more carefully. But anyway, the point is that after Bakhmut, after the Battle of Bakhmut, the Russians, in May 2023, the Russians equalized in quality and training levels with the Ukrainians. And since then, they've moved further and further ahead of them. And I think that's probably right. And I think it also matches what we're seeing on the military industrial side as well. I've discussed in many programs how the Russians now have more of everything, more tanks, more armored vehicles, far more drones, far more effective artillery, many more shells, and they're able to use them far more effectively and efficiently than they were doing in 2022. And this source has previously provided me with information about Russian weapons production. And again, the figures are eye-watering and certainly significantly greater than even the West seems to acknowledge. So there it is. It's not just that the Russians have more men and machines than the Ukrainians. It's that they are now better than the Ukrainians. In fact, the quality gap, like every other gap, is growing. And we see this on the battlefronts, and there's been several commentaries that I've read as well, that it's now the Ukrainians who are having the major problems coordinating units around the conflict zone. Many Ukrainian units basically go their own way. They are resistant to orders. There is no clear command structure. There's been various attempts at various times to set up some kind of core command structure, bringing together various brigades and operating them together as a unit. I've heard about this since at least the spring of 2023, but it has never fully materialized, and I'm starting to doubt that it ever will, to say it frankly. I would also add that if we're talking about the Ukrainian military leadership, people like Syrskyi, Zelensky, and the other Ukrainian generals, it seems to me that none of them have had the kind of general staff training that General Gerasimov of the Russian army and the various senior Russian military commanders like Mordvichev, Teplinsky, and the others also have, which I would have thought was an absolute prerequisite for that type of higher command. So anyway, all of this is a long-winded way of getting to the point, which is that the Russians are indeed breaking through. One of the reasons, I suspect, why we've seen this crisis in Pokrovsk, why things are developing so much faster there than we've seen in other places, is because, as many reports have confirmed, the Ukrainians are critically short of infantry. They don't have enough men to hold their positions. There are some claims that, especially to the north of Pokrovsk, as the Russians advance, they come up against Ukrainian dugouts and trench lines, only to find them empty of Ukrainian soldiers. The dissident Ukrainian MP, Mariana Bezuglaya, has previously written and talked about this, but apparently in the area north of Pokrovsk, an area where the Ukrainians presumably did not expect that they would have to fight, or at least not fight at this stage in the war, Russian advances are as rapid as they are because, as a result of the general shortage of men, the Ukrainians have no infantry to hold their positions. So, alongside all of that, as I said, we now also have this growing quality gap. And all of this leads me to think that we are probably significantly closer now to the big breakthroughs, the collapse, the cascading collapse that the Russian Defense Ministry spoke about some months ago than we have been previously. Maybe it's a little premature to say this, but the collapse in Pokrovsk seems to be happening at almost the same speed as the Ukrainian collapse in Kursk region in March, when the Russians captured Suja, which everybody had expected the Ukrainians would fight to hold on to for weeks, in just basically over the course of a single day. Pokrovsk is, of course, a much bigger place, and the battle for Pokrovsk will take longer. But it does seem to me that perhaps the collapse in Kursk, in Suja, might have been an indicator not just of disorganization and weakness on the part of the Ukrainians in Kursk region, but perhaps across the front lines as well. So anyway, we shall see interesting developments on the front lines. There was another apparently big missile and drone strike by the Russians in Odessa. I've seen more reports that the Russians have destroyed more trains, Ukrainian trains, ferrying equipment. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Europeans will not be supplying Patriot missiles, despite what Boris Pistorius said, apparently until the spring. The deliveries, the spring of 2026, the first deliveries of Patriot missiles will be in 8 months' time. I wonder whether people in Europe yet understand how critical the situation in Ukraine has become. Perhaps when Pokrovsk falls, and perhaps when the crisis in Konstantinovka strikes, and there are more reports that the Ukrainians are now evacuating civilians, not just from Kramatorsk, but from other towns in this area, from the town of Dobropilya, which is located to the north of Pokrovsk, for example. Perhaps when this happens, finally the penny will drop in Europe that the war is indeed being lost. I think, as I've discussed in previous programs, that Zelensky and his officials finally understood that Ukraine was losing the war, or was going to lose the war, some weeks ago, earlier in the summer. I don't think they have any real doubt about that anymore. Whatever they might say in public, I've already discussed their motivations and their actions. But I get the sense that in Europe, some people still continue to cling to their own illusions. Just saying. Anyway, there it is. Now, I just wanted to say a few further things about the political situation before moving briefly to other topics. There's been a very good article in Responsible Statecraft, the media outlet of the Quincy Institute, by George Beebe, who is one of the major commentators there. And George Beebe has been basically analysing and going over a lot of the problems. He's been conducting a kind of autopsy into the failure, if you wish, of Donald Trump's negotiating strategy after he became president in January of this year. Trump came in saying that he would end the war as quickly as possible. He initially said he'd end it within 24 hours. I don't think anybody should take that seriously. But then he went on to say that he wanted to end it quickly. He expected it to end it quickly. But of course it didn't happen. And as I discussed after it happened, when Trump met with Rutte about 10 days ago to announce the new arrangement about weapons being shipped to Ukraine from the United States via NATO, that NATO would buy them and then donate them to Ukraine, but that NATO would pay for them from the United States. And when he also announced his 50-day deadline for further sanctions, for tariffs and to be imposed on Russia and secondary tariffs to be imposed on other countries, China and India, it seemed to me that he looked far from his usual exuberant self. In fact, he looked, I thought, rather stressed and, if anything, a bit downcast, and perhaps somewhat bewildered that things had not turned out as he'd expected. Now, I think George Beebe in this article, which goes, "No NATO for Ukraine," is key to jump-starting stalled talks. And George Beebe then goes on to say, advice to Trump: if you want a deal with this Russian demand before calling for a ceasefire. I think George Beebe has got this basically right. We've discussed this many times on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, where Trump went terribly wrong was that instead of seeking to address the serious issues in the war, he allowed himself to be persuaded by General Kellogg and others on his staff that the way to get a quick win was to push for a ceasefire. And he seems to have assumed that the Russians would agree to a ceasefire, and that what he needed to do was to pressure the Ukrainians into doing that also. He never seems to have taken the demands that President Putin made and which he set out in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024 seriously. He never seems to have believed that those demands were for real. He made a speech before he became president in which he said that he thought that the decision to offer Ukraine NATO membership was a mistake, and that he understood why the Russians would be unhappy about it, and if he was in their position, he would be unhappy about it also. He seemed to think that that was all he needed to say on that topic, and that the Russians, who he seems to have assumed, were also suffering overwhelming losses, and that their economy was under pressure, would then seize on those words of Trump about NATO and would accept the ceasefire. And that a ceasefire would indeed be in place by Easter. I'm going beyond what George Beebe said, but I don't think radically. By Easter, and the war would be over, and of course there would be things for the Ukrainians and the Russians to talk about, but they could be left alone to do that by themselves. Now, as George Beebe rightly says, that was a diplomatic strategy that was certain to fail. It didn't address the Russian demands, and it didn't recognize the central Russian demand, which was about NATO. It assumed, or appeared to assume, that the entire war was essentially a territorial grab, that the Russians were only interested in gaining control of territory in eastern Ukraine, and it also seemed to assume that if the United States told the Russians that they could have Crimea and that the United States would not object if the Russians held on to Donbass, that plus Trump's reassurance about NATO would be enough. Now, I have to say, that seems to me an accurate reflection of Trump's approach. I've been following everything that Trump has been saying, and it was extraordinarily naive. Because, of course, the Russians were never going to accept a single speech by Donald Trump saying that NATO membership was off the table. That was not something that the Russians, in light of everything that has happened, would ever accept. And of course, what Trump said in that speech has been systematically undermined by the Europeans. Merz, Starmer, Rutte, they all continue to insist that Ukraine is on an irreversible course towards NATO. And why should the Russians believe Trump, given that America's own allies are contradicting him? And the President of the United States never at any time took action to tell them that they were wrong and that the United States did not agree, and that these declarations that Ukraine was an irreversible course towards NATO, that these comments needed to be reversed, and that the United States would take it strongly amiss if they were not. I'm not saying that even that would have satisfied the Russians, but at least it would have reassured them to some degree. So ultimately, the question of Ukraine's NATO membership, of its status, was never really addressed at all, nor were issues about the size of the Ukrainian army, nor were issues about the provision of Western military equipment to Ukraine, nor were issues about the internal arrangements and governance of Ukraine itself. Trump seems to have thought that if he asked for a ceasefire, that would be enough and the Russians would accept it. I come back to what I've said in many programs. It's implicit in what George Beebe has written. I should say I've had a discussion with Anatol Lieven, who's a colleague of George Beebe at Responsible Statecraft. I don't want to say too much about that because it was a private conversation, but suffice to say that we both agreed that there were some fundamental problems in the negotiating strategy that the United States followed. And Glenn Deason and myself have done another program with John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer, in which, of course, he's made exactly the same point. Trump seemed to think that if he simply proposed a ceasefire and made that speech, that would be enough in itself. It never was or would have been. What this conflict needed was a proper negotiation with proper, well-organized negotiating teams between Russia and the United States. It wasn't done, and here we are. Now, I believe that we are now close to the point, following the events on the battlefields, when it is no longer going to be possible. Unless something happens in Washington over the next couple of weeks, before the whole of the Donbass falls under Russian control, I think that the Russians are no longer going to be incentivized to negotiate seriously any further. We will have more meetings, no doubt, in Istanbul, but the Russians will simply repeat the same demands, and before long, they're going to start hardening them. They might already have done so, for all I know, at the last meeting. We have not been told exactly what the Russians told the Ukrainians at that meeting. All that we know is that they made no concessions. So there we are. I think this is the situation that we are now looking at. And Bloomberg has recently written a piece saying that Ukraine is becoming Trump's Afghanistan, that just as the collapse in Afghanistan badly damaged Joe Biden's reputation, so the collapse in Ukraine is likely to do the same for Donald Trump. And I have to say, I think that is quite possibly right. Of course, Trump has internal difficulties, which I don't propose to discuss on this program. But I think that the opportunity to achieve a settlement was lost, and I don't think it's going to come back. Now, on other things, I noticed that the State Department is now saying that Donald Trump is not tied to his 50-day deadline. It's been suggested that if something happens in the negotiations, he might bring that 50-day deadline forward and impose sanctions and tariffs on China and Russia and India and all those countries even sooner, or conceivably he might defer doing that until later. The one thing the White House spokesman has said is that President Trump continues to reiterate and to insist to Congress, to Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, that he wants to have sole and exclusive control of whether sanctions and tariffs are imposed. He clearly doesn't want congressional oversight over something like that. So that, it seems to me, is the battle. Clearly Trump is not keen on imposing these sanctions and tariffs. If he says that his 50-day timetable really isn't a timetable or a deadline at all, then I think we can perhaps stop worrying too much about it. What is happening is clearly that there's a complex negotiation underway between Trump and the Senate. I don't get the impression at the moment that Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal are in much mood to make concessions. The way to cut through this is for the president, or maybe the vice president, to actually go to the Senate, to meet with the senators, to explain to them the situation and the risks to the world economy if tariffs and sanctions are imposed in the way that they demand and in a way that deprives the president of flexibility, and that seeking congressional oversight is going to create more risks and problems and send the wrong signal to the markets. I think that is what, as I said, they need to do in order to see this thing off. Whether, of course, they will do it is a completely different question. For the record, I have been reading commentaries on oilprice.com, including a long discussion about the state of the oil market by Irina Slav. You can find it there. And the point is that the market is tight. It is very balanced. The balance between supply and demand is very much synchronized at the moment. If there were a major supply shock, if the Russians were withheld oil from the markets, or alternatively, if the sanctions actually did cause a fall in Russian exports of oil, we would see the oil price explode. Now, on that topic, it's just worth bearing in mind that if oil prices rise, and rise substantially, even if Russian oil exports were to fall as a result of the sanctions pressure, the likelihood is that receipts would actually increase, because in conditions of oil shortage, there would still be a demand for some Russian oil, and the Russians would be able to sell it at a significant price. Now, today, even as I'm making this program, I've seen a report which confirms that the Russian Central Bank has done exactly what I and Alex Christoforou predicted in a program we did last week, and which I predicted on this channel. It has cut interest rates from 20% to 18%. Not enough in itself to change the credit situation on the Russian markets, but a very, very strong signal to the markets that interest rates are indeed coming down. The very latest reports from the central bank suggest that underlying inflation in Russia has now fallen to 4%. And last week, Russia actually experienced deflation, falling prices. So it seems to me that this period of high inflation in Russia and the high interest rates that have followed from it is ending. We will see interest rates fall, and over time, probably not so much this year, but fairly soon, we will see a revival, a return of growth. I doubt that it will be the 4% plus growth that we saw in 2023 and 2024, which, as we saw, caused significant overheating. But we will see growth nonetheless, and indeed the growth curve in Russia is going to continue to rise as all of the various investments that have been made over the last couple of years start to produce factory spaces and machine tools and begins to produce results. So, the tariffs and the sanctions that are being threatened against Russia are not going to affect this picture, so I predict. I think it is delusional to think that they are. I think next year we're likely to see a growing Russian economy with less inflation, even as we are likely to see a contracting Western economy, especially European economy, probably with higher inflation. Quite what the political effects of all that will be, especially if we see some kind of a military crash in Ukraine over the next 12 months, it's difficult to say. I suspect the response will be strong, but anyway, we will have to await and see how it will develop. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon over the next the next few hours, and tomorrow we'll no doubt have more information from the Pokrovsk situation. I think this is a bigger battle, a more important battle than the Avdiivka battle of last February and of the Bakhmut battle in May 2023, just saying. But anyway, we will see how that battle evolves. But at the moment, as I said, the pace of events is fast, and there's no reason to think that it's not going to continue to get faster. So let me remind you again, you can find all our various programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.